Hello. My name is Father Bradley Starr. I'm the pastor at Good Samaritan Catholic Church. I also serve as an auditor at CAUSM here at the tribunal every Tuesday. It's a pleasure, actually, to be here with you. And I know we're talking about canon law. We're supposed to be teaching priests about canon law, right? And I do think we're talking about nullity cases still, yes? So we talked about lack of canonical form. We talked about impediments. So what is this third thing we're supposed to be talking about right now when it comes to nullity cases?
Thank you, Father. Thank you very much. So, yes, we are going to speak about the third source of matrimonial nullity. So let's do a little recap for our fellow priests in case we gave too much information. Okay, so far, the first class, we've explained what is marriage. Okay, and marriage is an agreement between a man and a woman to establish a partnership that is open to procreation through sexual intercourse. So basically is the contract that a man and a woman do when the woman is going to become a mother, right? Hence the name matrimony, right? Matrimony comes from mother. It's the contract that a woman does when she's about to become a mother. And we spoke about the original contract and how it evolved through history. We also made a clear distinction between marriage in the sense of the consents being exchanged, which is what we say in Latin, the matrimonium in fieri, or the wedding, and marriage as the union that comes from that exchange of consent. So you celebrate the contract, and the contract generates a new reality that is that marriage. So marriage has two main meanings, and it's important to keep those clearly distinguished in the mind. Then after that, we saw that even though in the church we don't have divorce, we do have dissolution of the bond. So we don't use the word divorce because it brings all this secular civil divorce that the church opposed radically to from the beginning. So we explained the Petrine, the Pauline, and the non-consummation dissolutions. Basically, the bottom line there is the church cannot dissolve the ratified or sacramental and consummated marriage. The church can dissolve, therefore, the non-sacramental and the non-consummated marriage. And actually, this is relatively common. I mean, it's exceptional, but being exceptional in an institution like the Catholic Church means that the Pope maybe grants, I don't know the number, but maybe 1,000 dissolutions a year. I don't know, but that is exceptional because we're millions all over the world, and certainly here we do instruct those cases. But that is very different from the declaration of nullity, right? Which is the only available option to those who have marriages that are sacramental, meaning that both parties are baptized and have been consummated, right? The only option is to dig into the creation of the marriage and see, this element which is required for the validity of the marriage was missing. For instance, we saw the other day that Catholics need to marry through the canonical form. So the way we Catholics can access marriage is through the canonical form. If we go and celebrate a civil wedding, that is not a marriage. That traditionally, I know here in America things are different, right? But traditionally, we Catholic canonists and theologians would say the expression that these civil weddings do not have the appearance of marriage, right? They don't even have, which meant that they have no bearing whatsoever legally for us. And legally, this is an important point, I mean canonically, right? Because some people say, but your tribunals are not real tribunals. Your law is not a real law. That's not how we see it, right? We believe that we are our own system of law. We are not deputized by the governments to be institutions, to have legislative power, to have judicial power, to have executive power. We have that power since long before any of the existing countries existed, right? Many, many centuries ago, long before anyone would thought of America, the Kingdom of Spain, and no country was, and already the Pope had an ambassador before the Emperor of Constantinople, right? So we were here first. That's why, for instance, I think it's the Geneva Convention has that clause about the nuncio, the ambassador of the Pope, being the dean of the corps, of the diplomatic corps in a country, right? I mean, it's not mandated, it's allowed, right? Even if he's not the oldest ambassador. Why? Well, mainly as a recognition to the contribution of the Holy See to the peace in the world, but also because we were here before. We are the deans of the systems of law, right? Roman law is older, of course, but there is no living Roman system of law, right? Roman law is used as a reference, but there are no Roman law courts, tribunals, lawyers, right? But we do, right? Okay, we're a very peculiar system of law. That's true as well. So we today are going to speak about, welcome, Father, please take a seat. So we're going to speak today about the third source of matrimonial nullity. After the canonical form, your marriage can be invalid because of the impediments, which are very uncommon, most of them. I mean, we have cases of prior bond, which are relatively common, the prior bond cases, but we don't have many impediment cases other than prior bond, right? I told the other day, we've seen a few cases, which, I mean, relatively is a lot, because that is something that we thought was already gone, that it wouldn't exist anymore. Welcome, fathers, please take a seat. And please remember, we're recording, so any sound will appear in the recording. Can you please close the door? Thank you. Okay. So, yeah, I was saying that we've seen a few cases of abduction, which is something horrible, right? I mean, I've seen cases from Mexico of women that were literally abducted by force. So one case, right? I was appalled reading those things. So let's get into the third source. The third source, the main source also in terms of numbers, right, is the vices or defects of the matrimonial consent, right? So marriage is a contract that is celebrated, that is established by the exchange of consents, right? And that consent cannot be supplied. No one can give the consent instead of the spouses, right? Not you, I don't care, you're very holy priests, doesn't matter. You don't have that power. No one has that, not the Pope. The Pope cannot make two people married. The President of the United States, no one. Only the spouses, right? That means as well that if the consent is the thing that makes marriage, if the consent is missing, or say in a different way, because it's ultimately the same thing, if an essential element is missing from the consent, there is no consent, right? Because, and I'm talking to...
Can you give us an example of an essential element missing from consent?
I am going to, right away, yeah. By the way, please, because your voices are not going to be well recorded, let's keep the questions for the end, okay? But in the meantime, Father Bradley has the...
He's just telling me to do my job a little bit.
And you can come closer to the or bring the mic closer to you, yeah? Okay. No, I do worry because of the quality of the recording. Yeah, we got to think of the fellas that are going to listen to it later. Okay. So, I was saying, we're talking to priests, so you have the base of the theology. I can talk to you about theological stuff that you already know. For instance, you all studied the metaphysical understanding of the person that is behind our laws, which is not everyone knows these things, right? So we have this Aristotelic themistic way of understanding how humans are that not everyone shares. So if you go today to a school of law, secular school of law, or a secular school of psychology, probably they are not going to be in communion with what you say, because they tend to understand things more from the point of view of experimental sciences, and these concepts are metaphysical. Okay, so just a quick recap. Okay, the way we understand humans is, so to say, dichotomic, so divided in two parts, soul and body. Okay, that is not self-evident, not even in the Bible. If you go to the fathers of the church in the first 3 centuries, if you go to St. Paul, it's clear that they understood humans in a trichotomic, divided, so body, soul, and spirit, right? And there are many interesting theses written about this way of understanding. But, I mean, those let's say, nuances aside, we understand that we have a sensible part that is common with animals, right? We are animals. So the definition of human is the animal that has reason, right? A logical animal, an animal that shares in the logos, right? Which we believe is Jesus Christ. That is that part that sets us apart from other animals, that we call reason, right? Allows us to both take the world and tend towards the world in a different way. That's what we call the sensible part, is the instinct or sensible appetite, right? That tendency that we have towards the things as any other animal does, and the senses, the perception of reality that is sensual, that is sensitive, right? I have tact, also the internal senses. I have common sense, which is the less common of senses, etc., right? Our way to perceive reality is special. We have intellect, right? So we can say that this is a table, and also the thing I have next to my bed is a table, and the place where I celebrate the Mass is a table. But they are all very different. They have different colors because I have an abstraction, right? I have intellect, intus legere. I read inside of the things, and I have this amazing capacity of abstraction. And because I have that, I can tend to the world with a rational appetite, right? Which is the will, right? Other animals don't have a will. For instance, it's Good Friday, I'm starving, and I go next to a place where they are roasting Southern barbecue, and I start salivating, and I'm dying to eat that thing, but because I'm a human, I can hold myself. A dog, I mean, unless you put the leash, the dog cannot hold himself back because it's an animal, right? The dog can be depressed because depression is sensitive, but the dog cannot have an existential crisis, right? Who am I? What am I doing in this world, right? That is only for us who have will, right? Who have intellect, right? This is the basis. You all have studied this more in depth. You know how we study in theology, theory of knowledge, or whatever was the course you took in seminar. This can go much deeper, but this is a general introduction to what is behind our laws of marriage. So for us to understand what the church says that is an invalid marriage, we need to have this metaphysical structure clear in the mind, right? Because as we're going to see, the consent is an act of the will, right? By definition. So what makes marriage invalid is something that makes an act of the will not valid, in the sense, as we're going to see, that it is either because the person is incapable of issuing an act of the will, or because the information provided to if you allow me that way of expression, which is typical in the scholastics, right? The information provided to the will by the intellect is erroneous, makes the act invalid, or because the act of the will, by the act elicited by the will, lacks something essential. Okay, this was maybe too high. Let's go down.
So, and you're not suggesting, right, that any deformity of the will would prevent marriage, right? I've only been a priest for 6.5 years, but I haven't really met a normal person in my life, right?
Yes.
So you're talking about something very specific on this, right?
Yes.
So what exactly are you getting at with this?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I need someone to put me down to earth. Thank you. Okay. So there are three main groups within these defects of the consent, traditionally called vices of the consent, right? Not because they are vicious, right? But because they vitiate the consent, rendering it invalid. We have the incapacities, the psychological incapacities. We have the exclusions or other vices of the will, and then we have the errors. Right? And I would like to just today go over those real quick. And I think this is good for you priests, not only as a general education, which is always good, right? I mean, we are, the priests are called to be men of study, right? Men of, but also it has a practical side, when you are dealing with couples in the confessional, pastorally, when you're preparing people to marriage, you are not the owners of the sacraments. You are their administrators, you are servants. So it's interesting, right, that the church wants all presbyters to be deacons. You don't need to. You could be ordained presbyters directly, like St. Augustine I think he was a presbyter before, but he was not a deacon, right? Was he directly bishop? That could be to the case, to be ordained directly, but no, the church has always, not always, but since very early established the cursus honorum. So the church wants all priests to be deacons, to be servants, to be minister. Minister is someone who's below, right? So as administrators of the sacraments, you cannot just randomly say, no, I'm not marrying you because I don't want. That's an abuse of power, right? You cannot do that. Who are you to say that? It's a fundamental right of people to get married. You cannot arbitrarily say, but at the same time, you cannot admit to marriage those who don't want to marry. And so knowing these things is very important, because in many cases, you are going to be the ones that have the ultimate say, right? When people come to the parish. Okay, so let's get down into the actual cases, and then I'll try to give examples, which is usually the most juicy part of the part that people like the most. So the first thing are the incapacities, right? We have two types of incapacity. One is the physical incapacity, which is impotence, right? And we spoke about it a little bit the other day, right? Because it's classified with the impediments. It's not very precise to have that with the impediments, because probably it should be better with the defects of consent, in the sense that it's someone that is incapable. But impotence, as opposed to the psychological incapacities, is a very traditional ground. So it appears in canonical legislation since very, very long ago, right? Now, the psychological incapacities, plainly say, this means that someone is unable to give consent, is unable to issue a consent. There is no consent because the person cannot do it, right? Even though it may appears to be possible, right? That's the thing, right? Maybe you're celebrating a wedding and it's a big wedding, 200 guests, but it's just a putative marriage. It's not a real marriage, in the sense that we think, even though it sounds very bad in Spanish, puto, putas, putare means to think in Latin, right? And the putative marriage is the marriage that is considered true in good faith. Oh, I thought I was married, right? So the incapacities are always based, the psychological incapacities are always based in a grave psychological anomaly, right? Maybe you've heard the thing, they gave them the annulment, which is a wrong word, right? But it's okay. They gave them the annulment because they were immature. That's not true. And if they did that, they didn't do it right, because immaturity is not a ground for nullity, right? Immaturity doesn't make you incapable of subscribing a contract, right? We could, as we're going to see, speak of the severe pathological immaturity that some people have, right? That could be considered, that is the anomaly that causes the person to be incapable of consent. But it's not that you are not mature, right? The church, by the way, when we look at the validity of the marriage, we don't look for the ideal that you guys usually look for in the parish, right? So, and that's good. You don't want people to just get married and get done with it, right? You want people to live happy, successful marriages. You want them to have the tools to lead beautiful lives. It's very difficult. I'm married now. Marriage is tough, right? But when we look at it from the point of view of the tribunal, what we're looking is not, were they the perfect husband and wife? That's not our question. Our question is, did these people meet the minimum requirement to be validly married, right? And we're not looking for the ideal. We're looking for the basis.
So a quick question. The work you're doing at looking at consent at the tribunal, which is after consent, of course, is different than what a priest is looking for when he's preparing a marriage?
Yes, certainly.
So real quickly, could you give quick criteria? Like, as a priest, I'm preparing somebody for marriage. What are my limitations at looking at consent, things that vitiate consent?
Yeah. Well, I answered yes, because I was not thinking about the minimum requirements for accepting someone to getting married, right? I'm talking about you as pastors. You gotta lead people to heaven, to sanctity. So you should always strive for perfection, right? For the ideal, the better, the best, right? So when we look into a marriage, aside from the dissolution cases, what we are trying to find is moral certainty that the marriage was invalid. Moral certainty was defined famously by Pius XII as that degree of certainty that excludes the probability of the opposite, but not the possibility of the opposite, which is basically the same as the secular concept of proven beyond reasonable doubt, right? So if seeing the whole of the proof, I have no reasonable doubt that this marriage was invalid. I mean, there could be, right? Well, what if this very weird thing had happened, right? Well, yes, right? But considering all the proof, I don't have any doubt that the probability of this marriage being bad is excluded, right? That is what we're looking for. We're looking for moral certainty. You guys, on the other hand, what you should be looking at is two things, right? From the point of view of the rights of the people, is do these two persons meet the minimum requirements to accept them to marriage, right? Like, for instance, I have a gentleman here who wants to get married and is saying, this is going to last 7 years. After 7 years, I'm out. Then what sorry, but you're not into marriage. This is not a marriage what you want. What you want is something else, right? And then it's not, you are officially excluding them from this, not admitting them to the celebration, but it's them who are excluding themselves. They are telling you, right? However, because marriage is a fundamental right of people, in case of doubt, you gotta accept them to marriage, which is similar to what we have in terms of considering a marriage valid or not. We have the favor juris, the favor of the law. So the law favors the validity of the marriage. If there is a doubt, until a tribunal says, no, this marriage was invalid, the marriage, even if you have serious doubts, enjoys the favor of the law, right? The favor juris. So the perspectives are similar in terms of accepting someone to marry and declaring are very, very similar. But I think that that's not the most important thing you do, right? The other day I was joking about one case that I got here when I arrived, right? It was, I think, a deacon who had, I'm not sure who was, so much better, right? You say the sin, not the sinner. So someone had already deposed the parties, which we don't do that. I know in civil law in America, it's going, the lawyer in the movie saying, Your Honor, can I depose the witness? In canon law, it's no, you cannot. We don't do that, right? So this one had already given a battery of questions to the spouses, and one of the questions was, is your relationship a relationship, is your marriage a relationship between three people, meaning you, he, and God, right? Those are beautiful things for you to do in the parish level. Maybe you are not all in the parish. Those things are true. You need God there, because otherwise this is impossible. But the perspective is different, right? And it's good that we have different perspectives as long as we understand the other perspective. So I, as a diocesan judge, need to understand that my thing is not everything, right? But I also need priests to understand that my perspective is very important, right? Because I don't think we canonists have prejudices against pastoral means. Maybe we do, I don't know. But I see a lot of prejudice, rampant, I would say, in the Catholic Church against canon law, right? And I think that's very wrong. That's very wrong. We have, I think is a Protestant prejudice, actually. It's typically Protestant. We have always been a church of laws. So from the very beginning, from the establishment of the church, before the triumph, if you want to call it like that, of Christianism, if not the doom of Christianism with the emperors becoming Catholic, we have always had that pretension of being a public juridical person. We come from Judaism. Christ is the new Moses. Yeah, The Sermon of the Mountain is the new law that is given by Christ. The Holy Spirit is the law that is inscribed in our hearts. You have, in the Bible, you already have the first synod of Jerusalem. We have been issuing laws, and it was funny, right? How Calvin burned down the Corpus Juris Canonici. By the time Calvin died, they already had bigger legislation than the one he burned, right? So I think it's very important for priests, without falling into legalism, which is the opposite. I mean, a good canonist is never a legalistic person. We are not about the little thing and we understand, and the Catholic understanding of law is the one you see in the tradition of the Old Testament. The law is a path. The law is a teaching, is a master, is a teacher that guides you like a father. You guide me like a father holding his son's hand, something. When I quote the Bible, I always have to translate from Spanish. How is that? Te he guiado. I've guided you like a father guides his son, right, through life. That is the understanding of law, right? The law is the pedagogue that brings us to perfection. The law is not there to make us good fulfillers of the law. The law is there so that one day we don't need the law, as St. John of the Cross says. No, here, there is no way here anymore, because for the just there is no law. Right? The law is the beginning, so that one day you can have virtue, so that one day you have the mind of Christ and you are full of virtues, and you can. But you need to start by that. I mean, you cannot be Cristiano Ronaldo right away. You first need to drill the basics, right? You need to start and one and again 1,000 times, and then you can be creative and you can be awesome. Right? Not just breaking with the law. Okay, so incapacities. Sorry, guys. The incapacities. We have 3 grounds of matrimonial incapacity, right? The first one is the most common, amentia, or lack of use of reason. This is something that is so evident that we don't even need a psychologist to intervene there, right? The lack of sufficient reason, these grounds of incapacity are in Canon 1095, right? The lack of sufficient reason is the typical person, I mean, typical, maybe not for you, but in my line of work, the typical guy who's drunk or high under the influence in the wedding, right? Those are typical cases. People who have an epileptic attack, and despite having that attack, the priest goes on with the wedding. By the way, something that I am very surprised, I don't know if, I mean, these cases were always like extremely kind priests who were not very aware of the environment. But if you see someone with the eyes injected in red, and yeah, dude, wait, I mean, say, you are not ready. It's okay. I know it's gonna be horrible, and the bride is gonna be mad, but seriously, going on with that wedding is a sacrilege. It's basically a sacrilege. Don't do it. And everyone is going to be mad at you later on. Why did you allow this to go on, right?
Yeah, something I always tell my couples, I don't know if I tried, is like, don't drink anything before the night of the wedding. Like, if I smell any alcohol in your breath, there's no wedding. There's nothing. So,
well, I don't know if you'd be violating a little bit their fundamental rights. a little bit. But you're so right in that today it's very common to have the groom's party with the champagne bottle and more champagne, and the ladies, the bride's party. Whoa, that is very dangerous. So I think it's very good advice. Like also that priest that talked to us in seminar about confession and said, he came to the class, and he said, first advice, the confessions always after the bachelor party. Confessions always after the bachelor party. See, I think it's also pretty wise. So these are very self-evident cases, right? And I've seen a few, not many, to be honest. I mean, usually these weddings don't happen, but let me tell you a few examples, right? Without naming any fingers or pointing any names, right? But let me give you a few examples that are taken from real life. Okay, this was one gentleman who, on the way to the wedding, they did, I think it's called a submarine. So you are in a car, maybe you have a different name, I don't know. In a car, smoking marijuana. So the car acts as a submarine, so you get more and more the influence of it because you keep breathing on it, right? It's like you are inside of the smoke.
I think the term here is hotboxing. Is that what it is?
Hotboxing. Okay, so they were hotboxing. Thank you, fellas. This reminds me of. Have you read Chesterton, the Father Brown novels? Mm-hmm. So there is this. It's delicious when so he's speaking with a thief. That the thief thinks he's fooling the priest, and the priest acts like innocent. Oh yeah, well, and then at the end, the reveal is that the priest knew from the beginning that he was a priest because he had noticed that he uses a chain the way thieves do. That, how did you? And the priest is, our poor flock. And it's true. I mean, as priests, you know the world as no one else does. So your perception of the world is unique. No other male in any other culture in the world has the access you have to, for instance, the world of women. It's a very unique. Not even as husbands get that perspective you get, right? When a woman comes to you in the confessional and opens her heart, she's showing you something that males don't see anywhere else. And from a confessional, you get a very special perspective of the world that no one else has, right? You guys have an understanding of sin, of things that are very important for the lives of people that people don't really get, right? I mean, because who speaks about the experience of a prostitute, right? But maybe you know. Who speaks about the experience of a gay man? You know because you are listening to them in the confession. Who knows about these things that no one talks about, right? The sufferings of married people. Those things are marvelous, are wonderful. So you have an understanding. And of course, of sin, you should be experts of sin, vicariously, but you should be experts. You should know things, right? So, you know, a hot box. And this guy, let me finish. There was more. So they got into the church, and I don't know how the priest allowed them to celebrate the wedding. The thing is that he was so high, right, that when the time for the consents came, he was lost. So he wouldn't answer. And the groom, how do you call the guy next to the best man? The best man had to say, "Hey, it's your turn, man." And he goes, I do. Right? This was a case of incapacity. I mean, but this by the way is natural law, and this would be accepted in any other kind of, like for instance, let's say someone puts a roofie in your drink and you go to buy a super expensive car, right? And let's say the car dealer, instead of saying, okay, come on, yeah, man, go home. Oh yeah, sign here, $100,000, right? That would be a case of lack of sufficient use of reason, right? You were gonna ask?
No, you just said, so you said these are obvious. I suspect we're about to get into something that's a little...
Yes. Now we get into the difficult ones. So amenthia appears with this name, what we now call lack of sufficient reason, which is no, menthia, mens, no mind, right? This appears since a long time ago. But in the 50s of the last century, a new line of jurisprudence starts to appear as we understand better and better, thanks to the new psychological sciences, how our mind works, right? So there is an understanding of, well, maybe even if you don't have such a tremendous incapacitating anomaly, like maybe even if you could function for other things, maybe you cannot assess the essential obligations and duties and rights of obligations and duties, duties and rights of the marriage that you're celebrating, and that is what we call the great effect of discretion of judgment, which is a relatively new ground, right? In as much as it appears in the code, because it's a natural law ground, so technically you could declare a marriage invalid because of these. In the 2nd century, right? No one did. In these declarations of nullity started to appear by the middle of the last century, but certainly it could have been, right? It could have been declared invalid. The idea here, as I was saying, is that there is a grave psychological anomaly. So you have some serious problem in your mind, let's say you're depressed, let's say you have anxiety, you have bipolar disorder, any of the disorders that we know that make your intellect and your will incapable to function normally. So the minimum use that you need to issue a valid consent is impossible.
But you're not saying like bipolar in itself makes it impossible.
Thank you. Exactly. I am not saying that. I'm saying the opposite. Yeah. So for a marriage to be invalid on grounds of incapacity, you need two things. First, there must be a grave psychological anomaly. If there's no grave psychological anomaly, by definition, you are capable of marriage, right? So normal people, and sorry, I know this sounds super weird and super offensive, but it's just words, fellas. It's just words. When I say normal, what do I mean by normal? You know, this is a difficult word to use, right? But I gotta say it because we speak of an anomaly, right? That's the term coined by traditional jurisprudence, right? An anomaly, something anomalous that happens in your psyche that impairs you from understanding correctly or for willing freely, right? Something that cuts that natural way of functioning that we all have. Of course, it must be very serious. I mean, it cannot be just any little thing. And very important here, not to mistake the incapacity to use good judgment with the rushing into making a commitment. Okay, this is a typical, they eloped, they went to the Chapel of Love in Vegas. That's they didn't think about it enough. That's not what we mean when we speak of incapacity. Incapacity is not that you didn't think it through. Incapacity is even if you had wanted, you could have not used good judgment, right? So some people go, and I don't know, we were giving the example of the car dealer. Maybe I'm in a midlife crisis. I'm 43 now and I'm feeling bad. So I compensate with a Ferrari, right? And then 2 weeks later, I said, it was so stupid, man. I cannot pay for this. I cannot go to the judge and say, hey, Mr. Judge, please declare invalid the purchase because I was stupid. The judge is going to say, don't be stupid anymore, but the purchase is done and you got to pay. You got to pay or sell the car quickly. But I cannot just declare something invalid, legally speaking. So saying that you didn't contract the obligations attached to this contract because you didn't think it through. Okay, that would be an abuse on our side. And I gotta say it because this is open common knowledge. I'm not saying anything that the popes themselves have not said. There is a long history of abuse of this ground, particularly in our country, right? So declaring marriages invalid with a little... Actually, I think I have here a quote by John Paul II. He says, the ministry of the judge is a ministry of charity towards the ecclesial community, which is preserved from the scandal, big words, the scandal of seeing the value of Christian marriage being practically destroyed by the exaggerated and almost automatic multiplication of declarations of nullity of marriage in cases of the failure of marriage on the pretext of some immaturity, or psychic weakness on the part of the contracting parties, right? And I think, of course, like in most things that are wrong, they start with a good intention, right? So for you, priest in a parish, what you see is the bleeding case of this poor guy who cannot receive communion. And also because you go so orderly to receive communion in this country, which gets me mad, like let people go when they want. Because here, if you cannot go to communion, you're like a leper. You're like, oh my goodness, yeah, I get it. Where I come from, if you want to go with the first ones, you go with the first ones. If you want to go last, you go last. So those who cannot communicate, no one notices. But here, the few times I wasn't ready for communion and I had to stay in the pew, oh my God. Then I learned the thing you do with the blessing, and because it's like, you shame, right? It's terrible, right? Okay, So where was I? I got lost.
You were talking about the psychic anomaly has to be.
Yeah, so that there have been abuses with this ground, right? And I mean, I'm not saying this because I am a conservative guy or whatever. I mean, this is common knowledge. Everyone knows that the United States distinguished itself for being like the easy annulment country, right? There is even a thing called the American way. Seriously, it's in canon law we speak of the American way as a vague, free understanding of procedural law, which is very common, right? And for us foreigners, and I'm not the only one, for us foreigners, when we arrive here after having studied canon law abroad or even practiced canon law abroad, it's a wow, how you do this? Oh, you do it? Oh, so it's a aha moment, a surprise for all of us, right? The names that are used, the way the instruction of cases is conducted. So there have been abuses. For instance, with this thing I was just saying, they didn't think it through. They didn't think it well enough, right? So it was a lack of the due discretion, as if the discretion due for marriage was kind of a special level of discretion that is reserved for a few. That is the great mistake. Marriage is something that, let me be very clear here. I am not saying that 14-year-olds and 16-year-olds should marry, right? As I said last class, there is even a mandate for you, pastors of souls, shepherds of souls in the code, to discourage those who pretend to marry in an age that is much earlier than the age that is common where you live. But the minimum requirement to get married is that the development that you need to be able to marry, not to lead a wonderful marriage, to be barely minimum. Like, let's say the minimum age to go to war in this country, what is to 16, 18, right? So the bare minimum. It doesn't mean that at 18 you're good to go to war. Actually, you're never good to go to war, but that's a different thing. That minimum is the maturity of a normally developed 16-year-old boy or 14-year-old girl. Again, please, because they're going to cut this from YouTube and say, this guy is saying that 14-year-olds should marry. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that when we say this person didn't have the sufficient development of the mind to marry, what we mean is this person was less developed than a normal 14-year-old girl or a normal 16-year-old boy. That's what we're saying. So it's a very serious impairment of the mind, right? So grave defect of discretion of judgment applies mostly to the intellect that doesn't get either a theoretical or a practical level the obligations. That is why, I don't know if this is so common here in America, but in Spain, the church is very criticized because the famous get a lot of annulments, right? Oh, yeah, because she was a singer. Oh, because he was a bullfighter. And, I mean, half serious, half joking, I say, well, I mean, these people live in worlds where mental disease is very common. I mean, fame is something that messes with your mind. We are not used to everyone around us saying, oh, yes, oh, yes, oh, yes. It's not normal that all women want you, all men want to be your friends, etc., right? So that messes with your mind. So probably there is something about the famous getting the annulments. There is also a version of this ground that is the lack of internal freedom. So sometimes the anomaly impacts more directly in the will than in the intellect. Now, that being said, the will and the intellect are not two people that talk to each other. They are two metaphysical faculties, so there is a constant circularity. You know because you love because you know, right? Both things are true. If you wouldn't know anything, you couldn't love that thing. But also at the same time, there is an innate tendency towards reality that we could call love that makes us know things. And the more you love something, the more you know that thing, right? That's why I know so much about my wife, right? Those cases in which the anomaly impacts more directly the will we call those, which is like a subset of the grave effect of discretionary judgment, we call that lack of internal freedom. Let me give you 2 examples taken from real life. One typical case, the immigrant that comes to the country, like myself. When I came here, I was on my own. I didn't have friends. Thank God I'm an extrovert, because it's very tough, right? I've seen cases here in the tribunal of people who are alone, don't have family, don't have community, don't have anything, and it's horrible. I mean, for man to be alone, it's a curse, right? Actually, isn't it interesting that in prison, where you're surrounded by murderers, thieves, etc., the punishment is to leave you alone, right? To confinement in solitary, like it should be great. Yeah, let me get out. We need company. We die if we are on our own, right? Okay, so this solitude, right? New in the country, working hard, and I'm thinking of a gentleman who came from Mexico. He was a teenager, I think, when he came here, and he got a job in a Chinese restaurant, washing dishes, surrounded by people who spoke Mandarin. That was his day. He worked, I think, 12 hours a day, and he had a depression. As we say in Spanish, a depression of horse. I mean, it was terrible, right? In that situation, he goes online, and through Facebook, he reconnects with this girl that he didn't like at all, right? But the connection was his only hope. It was his beacon, his burning nail that he hung to, right? And he thought with tunnel vision, if I marry her, all my problems are going to go away, right? But if it wasn't for the depression, he would have snapped out of it. What do you mean? Of course not. I mean, I don't want to marry this woman. I don't want to be with this woman. It's just the depression talking, right? The depression in this case is the anomaly, and the way it affects the will is by making it impossible for him to assess what he's doing, right? Another example, this very frail Mexican young girl raised by very strict parents with these very traditional ideas. A lady only leaves the paternal home dressed in white to form a new home, right? The honored woman doesn't leave the home. This is serious, right? Very, very serious. Nothing like we have today here in America, right? So this girl who suffered from anxiety and was very, very easy to frighten, etc. She had this couple of times flirtatious thing with a boy, and once they had sex. She broke up with him afterwards, and then a few months later, another boy, friend of the boyfriend, comes up to her, and says, "You're not anymore with him, with, let's say, Johnny. You're not with Johnny anymore." "No, we broke up." And the guy says, interesting. The way I see things, when a woman has been with a man, she needs to be with him forever, implying that he knew that they had sex. Immediately, she was terrified, thinking, oh my God, they know about this. So she found the guy and married him to avoid public shame, because she was terrified. What's going to happen to me, right? No one issued threats. No one told him, you need to marry or else. No, it was just her own mind. But of course, that will, right, is disturbed by a grave anomaly, a grave psychological anomaly. Right? So those are 2 examples. By the way, this ground I'm talking about now is the king or the queen. I don't know if it's a guy or the nullities, as we consider them today in the ecclesiastical tribunals, this ground I'm talking about is like half of the cases, maybe 60% of the cases. So we are seeing a lot of this. And as you very well know, because you deal with real people, mental disease is on the rise. So we'll keep seeing it, I guess, for a while, right?
So just a quick question. Just tell me if it's too much. But somebody who, let's say, has a psychic anomaly that makes them immature by nature, forgive my ignorance, like somebody who suffers from Down syndrome or something like that. Mm-hmm. So they are by nature less mature. Does it necessarily mean that they can't get married, or does it necessarily mean they can't get married?
I mean, I think you brought up one issue, one disease, the Down syndrome, that is very interesting to study. So typically, when I studied, when I was studying canon law, when I was in canon law school, as the Americans would say, Down syndrome was one of the disorders quoted for the lack of sufficient reason. So but there is, in Spain, there is this gentleman who has Down syndrome. I think he has 3 university degrees. He's the protagonist of a movie about his own life. So, I mean, he's amazing, this guy, right? Can we say that he's incapable of marriage? I don't think so, right? So ultimately, the anomaly is secondary, right? We don't care so much about the name that it's got in the DSM-5, right? I don't care so much for what the psychologist is going to tell me. What I really care about is, was there something anomalous, so something that is not ordinary, something that doesn't pertain to the healthy, harmonic development of the mind, operating in a way that your intellect and your will, which is the thing that matters when it comes to celebrating a contract, was impaired. That's what we're looking for. And by the way, you can have anomalies and get married, right? It's like you can be a saint and have psychological anomalies, like Saint Teresa of the Child Jesus, right? She clearly was disturbed, and she's a doctor of the church, right? And not the only one. I mean, saints that went through depression, right? How many of them, right? So marriage is not absolutely invalid because you have an anomaly, right? People, I don't know, typical cases are addictions, right? Addictions are very common nowadays, and many times they mess with the judgment. They mess with our freedom. They mess with our capacities. But that doesn't mean that because you're an addict, you cannot marry, right? The thing is the addiction making it impossible for you to understand what you're doing? Or, and I link with the next ground, which is the other incapacity ground, the incapacity to assume the essential obligations of marriage. There is an old aphorism that goes, ad impossibilia nemo tenetur. So no one is bound to the impossible. So if I promise you, Father, to give you $1,000, I mean, unless it was under duress, if I did it freely, I owe you $1,000, right? I made my word is my bond, I think you say in English. It's a beautiful thing. My word is my bond. So if I promised, I owe you. Unless you pointed a gun to my head, you threatened with killing or something, there was some extortion, whatever. Now, if I promise you to take you in my shoulders and fly you to the moon and come back, that promise is worthless because we would die in space, I cannot fly, etc., etc. That is, if I promise instead of $1,000, I promise to give you all the gold in the world, no one, not even the U.S. government, can get that, right? So those impossible promises are not binding. So if you promise something outrageous, okay, whatever. I don't owe you. So with marriage, which is a contract, happens the same. So if someone cannot, it's not that it's difficult, okay? It's someone cannot fulfill an essential obligation because of an anomaly, then you are not getting married because you are promising something you're not capable of giving. It's similar to the physical anomaly. So the object of marriage, the formal object of marriage, is the jus in corpus, the right to have sex, right? If you don't have a penis, you cannot marry because you cannot give the very minimum, the bare minimum of what you are promising, right? I mean, which is different of if you are unfertile, if you cannot have offspring. That's different because at least you can have intercourse. But if you cannot have even intercourse, then you cannot get married because marriage is a promise to have intercourse, right? So with psychological anomalies, we see, for instance, typical cases of people who cannot fulfill the obligation of being faithful, right? And by the way, I think, I'm not an expert in this. We have, by the way, in the tribunal, we have an expert in this. I'm looking forward to interview her because she wrote her doctoral dissertation on incapacity, and she's now a judge with us. I'm very proud of our staff. We really have a great tribunal. So people who, and this is how the ground developed in the 50s, as far as I know, people who had these psychosexual disorders, like extremely men who had personality issues that would be, it would be impossible for them to stop going to prostitutes, right? That would be an example, right? We see a lot of cases with homosexuality. We see some cases, right, with people, typically men, right? Not only, we see a lot of female homosexuality as well, but men who, for whatever reason, maybe because they weren't aware of their tendency or because they want to please their mother, whatever is the case, they get married. And then, truth is they cannot hold back, so to say. They cannot be chaste. They cannot remain faithful to their wives, right? And I've seen that, which is very different, by the way, to the homosexual gentleman who feels attracted by men, but despite that, because he wants to be a good father and a good husband, and he is. That's a very different topic, right? But when whatever is the issue, right? And by the way, I know today you cannot say, and we wouldn't dare to say, that homosexuality is a disease, right? I'm not getting in there. Absolutely not. What I'm saying is that for some people, it makes it impossible to fulfill the essential obligation of fidelity. Maybe even we shouldn't say that it's homosexuality. It's their lack of integration, of chastity, right? The other day, speaking with Deacon Tramonti, I spoke about what chastity is, because as you can see, this job of ours is about sex. So this is a job for the chaste, is not a job for the prude. Right? And chastity, you say prudiness or prudeness?
What is the prudeness?
So being a prude, being someone who, sex,
Prudish.
Prudish. So being chaste and being prudish are two very different things, right? Chastity is the virtue of loving with our bodies. Yeah. That is what chastity is. And I gotta be chaste with you. We gotta be chaste in our relationships among friends, among priests, with my parents, with my wife, with my daughters, Chastity is, hey, how you doing, man? Giving a hug. Someone who cannot give a hug is not a chaste person, right? As opposed, by the way, I'm not talking about the special consecration, some sisters who have renounced, those are different. But someone who is the same, someone who cannot get mad cannot be virtuous. Yeah, Christ got mad. And Christ used violence when he purified the temple. Right? So some people want to be holier than Christ. Right? Someone who's not able to get mad ever lacks fortitude, and fortitude is one of the 4 cardinal virtues. Right? So before some things, you need to and in terms of the concupiscence, you need to moderate that. And the way to express love, as a smile is chaste, right? A hug is chaste, given in the right time. So if, for instance, I am with a married woman and I start hugging her very hard as I would squeeze my daughter, that is not chaste, because that's where virtue comes into the picture, right? Virtue is the moderation of the appetite, the doing what needs to be done, the way it needs to be done, the time it needs to be done. Precisely, that is what prudence really is. Prudence is not being a little cautious. That is not prudence, right? Prudence is the practical wisdom, la recta ratio agibilium, the right reason of the things that need to be done, right? Okay, so our job is not for the prudish, right? Our job is about marriage, and marriage is about sex. So we are dealing with these things all the time, right? I know people who had to quit because it was I'm thinking of one particular canonist, a very bright person, said, this is not for me, it's too much sex. I cannot take it, right? And I get it, it's not for everybody, right? Okay, so these psychosexual, going back to my thing, these psychosexual issues were the ones that created that line of jurisprudence, as far as I know, but please take this cum mica salis, maybe it's not exactly what I'm saying, right? Okay, so these are the 3 grounds of incapacity, and incapacity means I am not capable, right? Incapacity is not, it was difficult for me, I was not completely ready, right? Or these expressions I get from the parishes, like they didn't really know the sacrament of marriage, meaning actually it's you that really get the sacrament of marriage, right? As if you needed to have like a special Gnostic knowledge of marriage for you to be capable to marry in a Catholic wedding. That's wrong. That's not what the church teaches, right?
If that were true, no one would be able to get married.
Exactly, right? Because we are not in the height of Christ. So, okay, so first set of grounds are the incapacity grounds that you cannot marry, because grounds that mean that you cannot marry because of a grave anomaly. Then the second big grounds in terms of declarations of nullity granted, and also some of the most traditional grounds, are the exclusions. Okay, so because marriage is an act of the will, right? If the will refuses to marry, or if the will refuses something that is essential to marriage, you are not getting married, right? And here the most common is the total simulation, the green card marriage, right? The pretending to be married, right? And people who feign a marriage in order to get something else, not to be mistaken with the people who marry for a different purpose, right? Because I see this mistake very often. People who say, oh, but they didn't marry for love. They married for the money. So total simulation. No.
So could you define total simulation real quick?
Yeah, total simulation is the exclusion of marriage itself. Yeah, so the act of the will is I refuse to get married, right? I pretend to be married. But let's not mistake this with I married for a different purpose, right? There are no right reasons to marry in terms of the law. Of course there is in terms of being happy, etc. But in terms of the law of whether this marriage was validly contracted, yes or no, there are no right reasons to marry, right? And I think we all need to be very aware when thinking about marriage that our experience of marriage is the French one. So the way we see marriages being celebrated today is the one that is weird, not the arranged marriages which were the norm throughout history, right? The destination weddings in Cancun of couples that have been together for 10 years, that's something that's happening now in this tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of history. Typically, marriage was a way to arrange life. And I mean, still in huge parts of the world, it's still being done by arrangement of the parents. I was watching a documentary about marriage in India, and this guy was interviewed and saying, my parents are very liberal. They allowed us to meet 3 times before the wedding, right? For them, it's wow, crazy, right? That you are allowed to even see each other before the wedding. And a friend of mine had a good friend from Syria, when in the north of Spain where we were living. I think they fled Syria with the Al-Assad father. So the father of the current one did something and they had to flee. And his marriage was arranged, right? And my friend asked, is it okay for you? Like, this is, right? Your mother is going to... And he said, well, I trust my mother. My mother loves me. And I trust, she knows women better than I do, and she knows marriage better than I do, and I trust her that she's going to make the best choice for me. I mean, now I'm used to this kind of thinking, but the first time I heard it, I was so confused, right? Wow. But it's important to be aware that our understanding of marriage is the French one. We are not the inventors of marriage, right? I will never stop saying this, right? Not even the Christians didn't invent marriage. Marriage was here. When Christ comes into the world, he comes, the incarnate verb, in a world with marriage, right? He starts his public ministry in a wedding, right? And he takes that thing and raises that to the dignity of sacrament. So, if someone says, I am tired of being hungry and poverty, I'm going to marry this rich person because I want to stop being poor, right? And if this person says, and I want to be with this person, I want to remain faithful to this person, I want to have sex with this person, have children with this person, that is a marriage. Who are you to say that this is not a valid marriage? Who do you think you are, right? Of course it is a marriage. A marriage is a partnership between a man and a woman open to procreation through sexual intercourse. That's what a marriage is, right? Right? You don't need to, but were you really in love in the day of the wedding? Who cares about that? Don't get me wrong. Of course we care about that. But from the point of view of whether you are getting married or not, whether you are in love or not is irrelevant. Your feelings are irrelevant. What matters is what was the object of your choosing when you issued the matrimonial consent, right? You were going to say something?
No.
Okay.
No.
So the exclusion of marriage itself, called total simulation, right? And it's called simulation as well, because in this case you deliberately are pretending to be married, right? The best example is the green card marriage. Oh yes, Your Honor. Yes. Oh, we love each other very much, right? By the way, I had to undergo the interview for immigration. I'm an immigrant. I just got my green card a couple years ago. And the lady there in the USC, it was so outrageous, right? I'm a judge. The judicial vicar celebrated my wedding. Can you have a more canonical, by the book wedding than mine? And she was all suspicious, right? And what do you do? And she was like thinking that we were there lying. And then, what do you do for a living? Well, I'm a judge with the Catholic Church. Her demeanor changed completely. She said, oh, okay. And the end of the interview, she said, you're approved, by the way. Don't worry, you're going to get it, right? So that's the first one. Then there are three traditional exclusions, three most common. You maybe remember from the first lesson, the tria bona, the three goods of St. Augustine, right? Those have been used traditionally for what we call partial simulations or partial exclusions of marriage, which are the exclusion of indissolubility, the exclusion of the offspring, and the exclusion of fidelity. Those three things are relatively common nowadays, right? So exclusion needs to be done by a positive act of the will. Positive, not that is good, positive as opposed to negative act. So positive in the sense that it has extent, that it exists. A positive act of the will is deliberate at the time of the wedding, meaning I want to marry you, but I want to have sex with this other woman. And if I cannot have sex with this other woman, then I don't want to marry you. That is a simulation or an exclusion of the good of the faith, according to the bonum fide or matrimonial fidelity. Right? And that causes the nullity of the marriage, as opposed to being unfaithful, which does not cause the nullity of the marriage. Right? Here, a typical problem we have with cases is that because he was or she was unfaithful a few years into the marriage, they accuse the nullity of the marriage based on exclusion of fidelity. Say, but he excluded fidelity when he was unfaithful to me. Yeah, but he excluded it de facto. The exclusion that makes the marriage invalid is the exclusion that deprives the consent. So that act elicited by the will is not a fully matrimonial consent. If you say, I want to marry you, but I don't want to have children with you, and if their children are in the picture in any way, then I don't want to marry you, then that's not a marriage, right? It's like saying, I want to marry you, but I don't want to have sex with you. Or I want to marry you, but I don't want to have children. I want to marry you, but I want to keep my right to divorce you. And if I don't have the chance to divorce you, I don't want to marry you.
Okay. It sounds like the only way to prove this is through a confession then.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, actually, that links with the thing I was going to say. We have an issue here of these people who say, oh, the marriage was invalid because my husband, my wife, cheated on me, right? When we go and ask them, they deny everything. They say, what? No, of course not. What do you mean? No, right? Even in cases I suspect that maybe there was an exclusion, they don't accept it. And as you point out very well, that positive act of the will, ultimately, we only can know about it through a confession. Because the internis neque ecclesia, right? You use that thing in your daily life as priest, right? The internal things, no one can know, not even the church. The internis neque ecclesia. I mean, who knows what goes inside of the head? Only God and the person itself, his or herself knows. So, if we don't have the excluder come to us and say, yeah, on the day of the wedding I was having an affair, or yeah, on the day of the wedding I was completely opposed to having children, or etc., we cannot know. Sometimes it can come to trial through witnesses. So, for instance, oh yes, the day before the wedding, we went for a walk and she told me, you know what, I'm seeing this other guy, I don't know what to do, etc. Right? That is what we call an extrajudicial confession. But without a confession, I mean, we would be playing God as judges to say, oh yeah, because he was a womanizer, I know that the day he married, he wanted to exclude the good of the faith. Well, I mean, you cannot say that. You don't know that, right? Okay, so some examples, right? The exclusion of fidelity. I was edified, right, by a gentleman who came here. He was the respondent in a case, and he was a womanizer, like a serious, committed guy. He had studied, and he had read books and went to courses and taken classes on how to seduce women. He was what they call a pickup artist, right? And he really was. And he came to be deposed. Well-presented guy. I mean, I don't know much about what man is attractive or not, but if I was asked, I would say, yeah, I think this guy is attractive, definitely, right? Well-presented, well-groomed, well-dressed, well-presence, good presence, you know. And humbly, he said, yeah, I was a womanizer. And he confessed there, humbly, that the night before the wedding, he had slept with another woman. He was... And he said, I'm changed now. I don't do this anymore. I've changed my ways, right? So, I mean, we say in Spanish, arrepentidos quiere Dios. Right? Repented wants God, right? So, yeah, there is more happiness in heaven for him than for people like us who never appear to do something wrong, but maybe inside of our hearts we are vain like demons, right? As those famous nuns who were chaste like angels, but vain like demons, right? Or proud, like demons, proud, right? Exclusion of fidelity happens also in cases of these swingers, of people who are de facto having an affair at the time of the wedding. But it's different from knowing that it may be difficult, right? That is not an exclusion. The exclusion is an act of the will, not an act of the... Of the intellect, right? So knowing, oh yeah, marriage is tough, who knows, yeah, I know many people cheat, maybe it will be difficult, that is not an exclusion of fidelity. The exclusion of fidelity is the deliberate will, and by the way, it needs to be prevalent. Because, I mean, ultimately, given the conditions, right? What if it's this woman, right? I don't know, right? If they start putting money on the table, right? In that condition, would you cheat, right? Who's so holy that can say, no, I would never, right? So, with the exclusion of fidelity, with exclusions, with all exclusions, the exclusory act needs to be stronger than the act of consent to marriage. So it needs to be something like, I want to marry you, so I want to live under the same roof, have sex with you, have children with you, create a family, live together, but I also want to have this other person in my life and have sex with them, etc. And if I cannot have that, then I don't want to marry you. That is the exclusion. Okay. Now, with indissolubility, it's the same. I want to marry you, but I want to keep my right to divorce you. Or else, I don't want to marry you, right? That is an invalid marriage. And this is not the typical case, right, of the, divorce is there, right? And let me address something that I've heard from very good priests, right? That idea of most marriages are invalid, right? Yeah, I've heard, So I remember... I know the Pope said it now, but I'm not going to address that. I'm not going to address that. He's the Pope. I have nothing to say. But we had a great spiritual director in the seminary. The priest. Those priests that their identity is priest, right? Great guy. Wonderful priest. Wonderful. I mean, kind, man of prayer. And he had that idea. Most marriages are invalid. And I have no doubt that comes from a good place, from someone who has taken spiritual life seriously and says, no, this is not for the mediocre. I mean, here we are to give everything and die with Christ in the cross or nothing, right? And I think that's how you should take your own ministry, right? I mean, don't go half thing. Burn the ships, go all in, right? However, that doesn't apply to the validity of marriage, right? Which is the thing, right? I think those good priests that say these things, of course, from a good place, a place of faith, a place of seriousness, of wanting to do things right, they don't get the implication for society. I mean, so you are implying that something that is natural to our human nature, something that a teenager is able to do, something that is a fundamental right, is almost all times not performed. So we are making false sacraments constantly in the church. Probably that ideal of being good are making us lose sight of reality, right? What is the good is the enemy of the best, or right? My idioms in English suck, but that's very true. I mean, thinking, oh, divorce is an option. I mean, we all do. Even the most pious Catholics are aware that nowadays, I think it's half of the first marriages and 3/4 of all marriages end up in divorce. So you must at least be aware that maybe your own marriage ends up in divorce. I mean, when I was a child, I was very lucky to be born in one of the healthiest societies in the history of the world, the Spain of the 80s. I mean, there were no divorcees so in my class, there was one girl whose parents were divorced. Everyone had a father and a mother at home, right? It was a Catholic society, a traditional Catholic society with very few, I mean, drugs were not all over the place. Very few people were in prison. Divorce was scarce, right? But nowadays is different. However, that knowledge that divorce is in the picture doesn't make our marriage is invalid. Right? What makes the marriage invalid is the will, and a prevalent will to the matrimonial will to have an invalid marriage, to get a divorce. And let me give you an example. This gentleman was living; they were together, cohabitating, right? And at some point, she gave him an ultimatum and said, look, I'm tired of this. Either you propose or I'm out of here, right? And he said, okay, yeah, let's do it. So he proposed. But then a few weeks before the wedding, he said, what am I doing? I'm not in love with her. This is wrong. So he went to his father, who had been married and divorced 5 times, right? And the father, not a very good advice, not very good fatherly advice, told him, look, if you do the right thing, everyone is going to hate you. I mean, it's like, I cannot even conceive. Like, if you do the right thing, everyone is going to hate you. Marry her now, and you can get a divorce later. That is an exclusion, right? The exclusion happens because something weird, something out of the ordinary happens right before the wedding that makes you aware and makes you foresee, and that is when you introduce the exclusion. Because most people, even those that consider divorce a wonderful institution, a progress of mankind, even those, when they get married, typically they want to grow old together. They have the dream of being different, not right, having a good marriage, right? However, if someone was to say no, I don't know, marriage is a chemical, falling in love is a chemical reaction that lasts 7 years, therefore marriages should last 7 years. If you allow those people to marry with that clear idea, 7 years and I'm out, that would be an invalid marriage, right? However, you typically don't get those in the Catholic Church, right? But you could. So be in the lookout. We have exclusion of fidelity, exclusion of indissolubility, and exclusion of children. So exclusion of children is not the knowledge, again, that we are not going to have children. Exclusion of children is the deliberate, determinate will to avoid having children, or to be more precise, the exclusion of the acts apt in themselves for procreation, right? No, this is I'm getting a little technical. The acts that are apt in themselves for procreation of children. So technically, what you are excluding is not children in general. What you're excluding is the right to sexual intercourse from which children can come, right? This means people who are sterile can marry, either because they are sterile in their young age, or because they grew old and they know children are not going to come. So those marriages are valid. What makes the marriage invalid is, I want to marry you, but I am not going to have intercourse with you that may lead to children, right? For instance, let me tell you an example that I usually give for this. This was a lady that was a professional swimmer, right? And she agreed with her husband not to have children until she was done with her career, right? Because she says, if I get pregnant, I cannot go to training and say, right? So I just can't have children. And he agreed originally. They didn't tell to the priest. They got married, apparently, right? And at some point, he changes his mind and wants to be a daddy. So he starts saying, hey, come on, let's do it, come on. And she said, no, this was not the agreement. We agreed on this. So you cannot ask that of me because I didn't give you that right? See, the right was not exchanged. The right to the acts apting themselves for procreation was deliberately withdrawn. That would be the case, by the way, also of someone who's willing to adopt, but not to get pregnant. Right? Let's say a woman who doesn't want to get pregnant because of the aesthetics of it and the changes in the body, but she says, no, we can adopt. Well, that is an exclusion contra bonum prolis, right? Speaking properly, because what you're excluding is not having a family. What you're excluding is the right to intercourse, an intercourse that, in case it is fertile, will produce children. Right? And by the way, the exclusion applies to those who, the exclusion of children applies to those who don't want children for the whole marriage, or for those who don't want children for a part of the marriage, like this lady. This lady would have been okay having children at 30-something when she was done, or 20-something, I don't know, when she finished her swimming career, right? But for this period, she was completely closed. That means that you are taking something essential from marriage. You are not giving to your spouse the right to sexual intercourse to act in themselves for the procreation of children. It would be the same with people who only want to use to have sex with contraceptives, right? That is clearly an exclusion of the offspring in the canonical sense of the term. And so then there are other exclusions, but maybe you can be aware of them, but like, for instance, the exclusion of sacramental dignity. I wrote my JCL thesis on this topic, right? So because marriage is a sacrament, if someone were to say, I want to marry you, but I refuse this being a sacrament, and they are both baptized, of course, because if they are not both baptized, there's nothing to exclude, right? There's no sacramental dignity to exclude. But if someone, both being baptized, were to say, I marry you, but I refuse this being a sacrament, and if it is a sacrament, I'm not marrying you, that is an invalid marriage. But, when do you see this, right? I think of one example. It's not a real one I know about, but let's say in Francoist Spain, after the Civil War, okay, so where Spain was a confessionally Catholic country, and only non-Catholics could get divorces, by the way, right? Because for Catholics, canon law basically applied. So imagine a young man who's received communist ideas from his father, right? Who died in the war. So he's his hero. He died fighting for the Reds, and he doesn't say a word, but he's read that the religion is the opium of the people. He's read Marx and Engels and all that crap, right? And he is convinced that you guys are the devil in disguise, right? And he hates God, the sacraments, religion. He despises that. He mocks that inside. But he lives in a little town where everyone is Catholic, where the priest is an authority. He knows he cannot be with his beloved girl unless he goes through a canonical wedding. And of course, he's baptized, because in Spain, even the atheists are Catholic. So for him to be with this girl, he needs to feign a canonical wedding, even though he despises that thing. So inside, he's thinking, I want to marry her, I want to live with her, I want to have children with her, remain faithful to her, etc., etc., but I refuse God, transcendental, the sacraments, or anything having to do anything what we were doing here. This is a completely different thing. That would be a case of exclusion of the sacramental dignity.
Would it apply to somebody who was baptized as a child but never learned their faith, became an atheist, grew up an atheist, and had that same feeling even though they never knew they were Catholic, right?
Yeah, so for sacramentality, being Catholic or not is irrelevant. For sacramentality, what matters is baptism. And baptism means the celebration of the reception of the sacrament, in all Thomistic theology, the sacramentum tantum. So as long as you've received baptism, regardless of whether your faith is alive or not, okay, you are baptized for all intents and purposes of your canonical status, of your ecclesiastical status. Of course, it's not irrelevant at all. I mean, your eternal destiny depends on it, right? Of whether you have a live faith or not. But for whether your marriage is sacramental or not, the only two requirements, we said this, I think, in the 2 lessons before. So there are 2 requirements: valid marriage, valid baptism. That's all. That's all you need to have a sacramental marriage. Of course, it happens. This is so it's not exactly the same, but it's similar to what happens with the, how do you say in English, the sfragis? So the grace that is marked on you by the baptism, confirmation, and ordination, the indelible mark. Thank you. So it's similar to el sello indeleble. Yeah. No. When I speak in English, words don't come to my mind. You should see me speaking in Spanish. Okay. So, la teoría del indeleble. Yeah. It'll come later. Later I'll remember. So it's similar. It's not the same. So because these 3 cannot be repeated, marriage can be repeated. These 3 last for eternity. Marriage ends with death. I'm married until death. No more day. It is the love of my life, not the love of my death. Okay. So I love her. Come on. Such a bad man. Thank you. So it's similar in the sense that if you receive the indelible mark of baptism and then you fall out of the life of the grace, the moment you turn your heart to God, that blossoms. No? It's like the desert of Negev, right? The rain brings out all this nature that was hidden there. That's what happens, right, according to a healthy theology of the sacraments. With marriage is similar, right? You have, because the grace of the sacrament of marriage is the grace of Christ who dies in the altar of the cross as the perfect husband for his church, right? Is the perfect gift of self. That is what St. Paul say, and ascribe this mystery to Christ and his church, right? That is the content of the sacrament of marriage. So marriage is about sex, but the sacrament of marriage is about love, right? There is like a revival, so to say, the moment the life of the faith goes back online, so to say, right? So there are similitudes, but it's not the same. But some things are exactly like that. For instance, and this is important for priests, if you have people who want to become members of the church, right? They are in RCIA. They want to be received into the full communion of the church if they are already baptized, or they want to convert and receive baptism. So those who are validly married, but in a non-sacramental marriage, you don't marry them when they receive baptism. They are married, right? That union, the moment both parties receive the grace of the baptism, that union becomes sacramental, right? Don't do the new wedding, because that kind of implies that you were not married before, and that's not true. Of course you were, right? Okay. Then there is another controversial one, but I don't want to get into it now, which is the exclusion of the good of the spouses. Very common also in America, right? And the idea is that, if the ends of marriage are the good of the children or the good of the offspring and the good of the spouses, then someone who excludes the good of the spouses is also not getting married. Yeah, but who excludes the good of the spouse? Like, what kind of Machiavellian mind? I'm not saying it's impossible, but when, right? And let me give you also an imagination. Imagine one of these mafia movies, right? That in the beginning there is a mass murder, right? And everyone dies, and then you see one little girl crawling out, covered in blood, and then 15 years later, and then she's a gorgeous girl that finds the mafia enforcer, seduces him, and marries him to make his life impossible, right? That would be a great movie, right? That would be an exclusion of the good of the spouses. So someone who marries with a deliberate intention to make your life deprived of any good, right? The abusive version of this, in terms of abusing the law, abuse of power, would be to say, oh, because he was not a good husband, oh, because she was not a good wife, then they excluded the good of the spouses. Yeah, but that is similar as to because they cheated on you 5 years after the wedding, they excluded fidelity, and that's not true. You need to exclude it from your consent. And I mean, I've seen so many weird things, right? I believe anything now. I mean, this is, by the way, a very interesting tribunal because we're so diverse. We get so many things, right? In Spain, in Italy, cases are more bread and butter, your everyday cases. Here, you're always like surprised. It's, wow, this really happened. Like I was saying before, cases of abduction. I mean, I would have never believed that I would live to see a woman who married abducted by force, by a horrible guy who took her. Well, I've seen it now, right? So, I mean, maybe someday. Another example would be someone who marries a woman to make her a prostitute, for instance, right? But I think even the most evil people, I mean, again, there may be exceptions, no? Like they say, with a very few exceptions, there are exceptions for everything, right? But even the most evil ones, the day they marry, I mean, they want to some extent to make their partners happy, right? I want to think. Maybe I'm too good, too naive, I don't know. Okay, so those are the exclusions, which are some of the defects of the will. There is also force and fear, right? Our will can be bent, right? Force is something, thank God I haven't seen that, right? Force is the person who's subdued in the ceremony, say yes, or the gun to the temple, right? Those would be the force. Thank God I haven't seen those. But do you remember? I'm a movie buff. You remember Robin Hood, the one with Kevin Costner? Yeah, when the evil guy, the Loxley, was like forcefully, yes, she's saying yes, yes, right? That would be maybe an idea. But in that, she doesn't issue a consent, so nothing like that. Grave fear, on the other hand, is pretty common. Grave fear is that someone threatens you so that you marry. So, for instance, relatively typical and very sad, youngsters who are boyfriend and girlfriend, they have sex, she gets pregnant, and the parents say, either you get married or you're on your own, right? And they are terrified. That, which is something that must never be done, right? Must never be done. As priests, you should tell the parents, hey, don't do that. I mean, that's wrong. That's sinful. I know it comes from a good place, whatever, but don't do that, right? That would be a case of grave fear, right? By the way, I also don't like the opposite side of the spectrum, right? We jurists are supposed to be the guys of the equilibrium, right? The ones that see all the possibilities, right? Not only the, right? They say that Catholics are out et Protestants are out. So a Protestant mind is this or this. So the faith or the works, right? This, the Bible or the magisterium. A Catholic mindset is the faith and the works, the Bible and the magisterium. This and that, right? So I also don't like the other thing, the idea, if she's pregnant, she cannot marry, which is also an abuse. Why? I mean, is pregnancy now a defect of the mind, right? Maybe the best thing is to get married. What I'm saying is, don't just solve the issue beforehand. Let's see the issue. Are they capable? Are they willing? Because after all, a marriage is the best place for children to come to this world, right? That's the best environment where you can be born, with a mom and a dad. That's what we need, right? And if possible, that they love each other. That's the best, right? They say that for us, it's more important to have a father and a mother that love each other than to have a father and a mother that love us. Right? I don't know if it's true, but si non è vero, è ben trovato. Okay, so great fear is there are threats from someone. It's not the psychological external pressure. It's not the societal pressure, right? It's someone comes and says, either you marry or else, right? And then the person falls in a subjective state of mind so that marriage is seen as the only way out. So if I want to be free from this, my only way out is marriage, a marriage that otherwise I wouldn't choose. Right? Another example from my videos, if you've seen the videos on YouTube, is from Titanic. Right? The mother that is saying to Rose, we are poor, and she's tightening the corset, right? We're poor if you don't marry the rich guy, daughter, and she's been afraid. By the way, in this sense, you who are constituted in authority, you got to be careful with that, because there is a version of great fear that is called reverential fear, which is the typical fear that comes from someone you consider an authority, so your parents, right? So it's not the same that, I don't know very well most of you, and you tell me, you got to get married. Your father crazy said something that I need to get married, as opposed to Father Ketter, who's my boss, and saying, he has an authority. So especially when it comes to the internal forum, when you speak in confession, when you listen, you got to be extremely careful, right? I was taught that when you get inside of the conscience, you gotta enter kneeling down, because you are in the sanctuary where God speaks to his beloved, the church, right? So you gotta be extremely respectful with that. And this is a ground where we see cases, it's typically the parents, but a spiritual director can have, right? I'm sure you all have too, right? But I've seen things. Right? Like the Iluminado, the who I've seen from the Holy Spirit, you have vocation. Yes, and it's for this convent. I'm thinking it was a real case. We went 2 buses. Yay, it's the vocation, amazing. 2 months later, she was back home, right? Those, you all seem to be very reasonable priests, but we all know that there are people who believe that they have the ultimate contact with God, right? And the Holy Spirit possesses me and speaks through me. That's wrong. So great fear and that subset of reverential fear, and then we have the conditions, right? You can condition, because marriage is an act of the will. You can condition an act of the will to anything, even crazy things, right? It would be, so I only marry you if you've never worn a yellow shirt. Okay. Normal people don't do that, but it is possible to do, to condition the validity of your marriage to the craziest thing you can imagine, right? And if someone does it, we cannot supply consent, and this is beautiful. This is how it is shown that the church is respectful of natural law in a way that secular systems of law are not. So in civil laws, in secular laws, you say, well, I actually condition the validity of my consent to whatever. You sign the paper, you are married. Get out of here, right? Get a divorce if you want. With us, it's not like that. So I condition the validity of the consent that we would move 2 years after the wedding to my mother's, and I was very clear about that. Then, if it's true, if it's really something that you condition the validity of your marriage to, the marriage is invalid, right? And there are three types of these conditions: conditions about the present, about the past, and about the future. The past and present conditions depend on whether the thing was fulfilled, so the requisite was fulfilled. So, for instance, I marry you if you have never smoked marijuana. If that is a real requirement, if you did try the devil's lettuce, then that marriage is invalid. I mean, it would need to be a very peculiar person to condition the validity of the marriage to that. But if they did, the marriage is invalid. Now, with conditions of future, doesn't matter what the condition is about, the wedding is invalid. And by the way, if you are preparing a couple for marriage and they have a condition about the past or about the present, so I only marry you if you are now the heir to the throne of China or something like that, right? You cannot celebrate those weddings without the permission of the bishop, right? And when it is a condition about the future, so about a future event, all weddings are invalid regardless of whether the condition was fulfilled or not, right? And this is because ultimately, if you condition the validity of your marriage to something, so let's say I marry you on the condition that you never smoke, right? So until the very last day, he can have a cigarette, right, or a cigar. So you don't really know if you're married until the moment where you're not married anymore, right? So you don't know if you're fornicating or if you're doing a beautiful gift of self. So to avoid that problem, that legal problem, the church says, okay, all marriages celebrated with condition about the future are invalid. And then we have the errors, which are pretty uncommon, right? We have two types of error that are relatively common. But let me just say, the general rule here is, if what you're wrong about is the essence of the thing, then your error makes your marriage invalid. If it is something accidental, then your marriage is valid. Let me explain. There are errors about the marriage itself or about the person. So if I am mistaken about the person I am marrying, I'm not marrying that person. No? It's the famous case of Rachel and Leah with Jacob, right? That he thought he was marrying this, but actually, so I think I'm marrying Peter, but I'm actually marrying John, right? I mean, this is extremely rare, but it could happen in a wedding by proxy or in a wedding with a veiled. Oh my, who are you, right? That's an essential error. It's an error about the person, individual person. By the way, you are not the man I used to know anymore. That is not an error of person, okay? Of course, he's the man. That's a poetic way of speaking. He is the man, he's changed. That's all, right? Now, if it's about a quality, then the marriage is not invalid. So, I thought you didn't snore, and you snore like a beast. Or I thought you were healthier. I thought you were not addicted to cocaine. I thought, those are, you were marrying this person. And by the way, we all marry with errors about the qualities of our spouses. So you get married and then the curtain goes up and you, oh, wow, this is the person I really married, right? That's when reality kicks in. There is one exception, which is the error about a quality principally and directly intended, which is an error not about a quality that made you marry this person. So I marry you because you're rich, and then you are poor as a rat, regardless you're married, right? Yeah, you were wrong, but what you wanted was to establish a partnership of the whole life, open to sex and procreation with this person, so you are married. A different thing is, I want this quality so much that I wouldn't marry someone without this quality. For whatever reason, because, I don't know, I want my husband to be blonde, let's say, right? Because I like Viking movies, whatever, right? And if it's not blonde, I don't, and you were tying, how do you say when you... Dyeing, thank you. You were dyeing your hair, and she was, this is not your real color. Oh, no. And she leaves, right? Immediately. I mean, poor girl. I mean, very mature, right? Maybe we should be looking into incapacity. But certainly, if that is true, if you condition the validity of your marriage to that quality, and that quality is not met, we cannot say that you issued a valid consent. Now, that being said, this is extremely rare ground, right?
How is that different than a condition of a pastor-present quality?
Beautiful question. It's not different.
Okay.
Beautiful, excellent. I love the question. Thank you, Father. See, I mean, we have here a great canonist in potence. Yes, Father, yes. No, I mean, you clearly have the mind. I mean, that's not an easy question. It certainly is the same, because error in quality principally and directly intended. The intended is the key. It's a ground of condition. Excellent. However, because the circumstance for that to happen is an intellectual error about a quality of the other spouse, is classified with the errors, but it's not an error, it's a ground of condition. Chapeau, right? And then you have the error about the essence of marriage, which is that you are ignorant, that you don't know that marriage is a stable union open to procreation through sexual congress. Like, for instance, Tarzan coming out of the jungle, right? So he's seen monkeys mating, but he has no notion of marriage. He has no notion of a stable union between two monkeys. He's never seen humans, so he doesn't know marriage. He doesn't know civilized human, right? And they say, hey, Tarzan, yeah, well, beautiful. Yeah, come, let's do a wedding. What is a wedding? Oh, it's a party. Come here. And do you, Tarzan, want to Jane in a lawfully? Yes, of course. That is not a wedding. He has an essential error, right? As an example of things that I thought I would never see, is that, and believe me, this is true, a woman who married without knowing about sexuality at all. So she had no clue that marriage was about having sex. She had no clue that the genitals of the spouses had to come in contact. Yeah. I seriously, when I studied the ground in canon law school, I said, I'm never going to see this. Well, I've seen it. I've seen it. And I mean, we did a great instruction with the case in the sense of very thorough, with witnesses, everything like very kosher. I am convinced that it's true, that she didn't know. And she was raised in a very special place, and she was married very young, and she had no access to sexuality at all. And that was an essential error, right? An essential error. And these so far, well, the accidental errors about the nature of the contract of marriage do not make the marriage invalid. I've written my doctoral dissertation on this topic, by the way. I'm not going to bore you. I made a serious commitment before today to not bore you with my doctoral dissertation. But basically, it's about this topic.
Just to let you know, I've heard hours of him talking to me about this doctoral dissertation.
You're a saint. You're a saint. Thank you, Father. Thank you, Father. So the errors about things that are not essential. So that's the permanent partnership open to procreation through sexual congress. These errors, things, for instance, people who, like all Protestants, who ignore that marriage is a sacrament. All the Muslims, the millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa who today believe that marriage is polygamous, who accept polygamy, right? They exclude the unity of marriage. To all the Protestants, Jews, many Catholics, and basically everyone with a couple exceptions in the history of the world who think that divorce is okay, or repudiation or any form of divorce, those people have an accidental error, right? What you need to do regarding these things to have an invalid marriage is to exclude with your will, not to know with your intellect, right? So we have seen in this lengthy class all the main grounds of matrimonial nudity due to defects of the consent. And I hope you guys are okay. And if you want to ask any questions, now is the time if you want, or make comments too.
You said about incapacity. They began their marriage well, they had a capacity, they developed incapacity. Does the marriage become invalid?
So you mean if after the wedding,
Of some years,
people develop a psychological anomaly that renders them incapable of marriage, right?
Even physical inability.
Yeah,
One person, then does marriage become invalid?
Yeah, no, it does not. So short answer, no, because what we look at is the consent, so the time of the consent. What we are judging is whether the marriage was validly contracted, whether at the time of the exchange of consent, so at the precise moment of the wedding, these people exchanged, were capable, the object of that's what we look at. What happens later is irrelevant for us unless to show. I mean, sometimes what transpires after the wedding shows what was going on in the wedding. For instance, the person that after the ceremony, on their way to the reception, they have a car accident and he becomes impotent, right? They are validly married. They're not going to consummate. So the Pope could dissolve that marriage, but the marriage is valid. It's validly celebrated. Now, there is one thing, however. Sometimes psychological conditions are latent, right? And it's already there. So the person already has the anomaly. And that anomaly is going to turn this person incapable. For instance, let's say someone who's addicted to gambling. He's already addicted, but so far we don't have severe consequences, right? So far, well, he spends a little too much, but it's not like we don't have shoes for the children at home, right? But then this addiction grows, and 2 years after the wedding, this person is incapable to support his family, right? Incapable of. That would be a case in which the development after the wedding of an anomaly makes a marriage invalid. Yeah.
So the immaturity, when one person was immature, but that person can become mature after marriage.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so as I was saying, immaturity is not grounds for nullity. Okay, so being immature is not a ground in the sense that being immature is not something that makes you unable to celebrate a contract, right? The immaturity that could be identified as the psychological anomaly is that pathological immaturity that you need to bring the kid or the man to the psychologist because he has issues, right? That would be a certain lightness of spirit, like we were not ready for marriage. No one is. No one is. Doesn't matter how hard you prepare, no one is ready for this thing. So immaturity is not a ground. Now, if you had that pathological immaturity or any other psychological grave anomaly that rendered you incapable at the time of the wedding, it doesn't matter that after the wedding you develop that maturity. Because again, the contract is celebrated at the exchange of consents. So if someone was to, I don't know, maybe someone comes to your confessional and says, Father, so I've been married for 30 years now. And the first 10 years, this and that happened. I had this psychological problem. And you are intimately persuaded that this person was incapable of marriage at the time of the wedding, then this person should renew the consent. I mean, because the marriage is invalid, which, I mean, it's very difficult with incapacities because incapacities are so difficult to assess. But it may happen to you with cases of exclusion, right? Let's say a man comes to the confessional and says, well, I've never confessed this, but at the time of the wedding, I was cheating on my wife, right? I was cheating totally. I mean, I had this affair and lasted, and now I haven't seen this other woman for 10 years, but I was ashamed to confess this thing. Well, the first thing is you need a convalidation. By the way, the real convalidation, not what we call convalidation in this country, which is not a convalidation. The people who celebrate Catholics who celebrate a civil wedding and then marry in the Catholic Church, that is not a convalidation. You are not blessing their marriage because they are not married. And by the way, this is not a crazy European conservative guy saying things. In the last CLSA convention, they spoke about this, and I was happy to hear that. So that language we use, also, we are the only country that uses this language, right? A convalidation is the validation of the putative marriage. So a marriage that in good faith you thought was valid. For instance, after 10 years being married, you realize you're cousins. You do the DNA thing and wow, we have an impediment. and the impediment is operative. So then you convalidate, you issue the consent anew, and you do a convalidation, right? Not the weddings of Catholics who attempted merely civil marriage are not convalidations, and the language is confusing to the faithful. We shouldn't use this language. We should say, when are you guys gonna get married? What do you mean I'm not married? You know, in the eyes of the church, you are not married, right? And I think there is maybe too much fear, like chalked to pastoral concerns in this sense. People are not stupid. People are not children who, oh, the priest said to me that I'm not. Yeah, I mean, so of course, yeah. What's the problem? You know it. I mean, in the Catholic Church, you need to marry with the priest. You didn't marry in the church. It's okay, right? People are not dumb. People are not children who can be afraid of monsters. You just talk to them like adults and say, well, you know, as Catholics, the way for you to get married is through the canonical form. So, okay, I just dropped it. I wanted to drop it somewhere in the course.
Actually, it's really funny because I just had someone call my office and lecture my front desk person about what a convalidation is, and I had to sit there and explain because of you. It's your fault. It's, like, no,
it's my
wrong.
fault.
Yeah,
it's my fault. I'm an agent of chaos in the diocese. Okay, some more things, more comments. Yes, Father.
So what if you learn about a potential defect and you're not a canon lawyer, so you're a parish priest, you learn about a potential defect an hour before the marriage in the internal forum, and a confession you're hearing for the the wedding party, right? Kind of what advice would you give?
Call us. We are here to serve, and I mean, we're pretty available. I know, for instance, Father Burke is amazing. I mean, he's so good. I wouldn't be so good as he is with last minute. I have a dispensation. Call us. Ask to. I mean, I've had some in articulo mortis conversations, right?
But that would be.
And then if you're on your own, left to your own devices, the rule is, in case of doubt, admit to the celebration, right? In case of doubt, marriage is a fundamental right of people that can only be limited in very special situations. So if you're certain, so if someone says, yeah, I mean, you are you're having an affair right now, right? Or they come to you and they tell us, no, we're swingers. It's beautiful because it's so wonderful, love, and that. Ooh, I'm sorry, I cannot marry you guys. And I mean, it's terrible. I don't want to be in your shoes. But if it's clear beyond doubt that what they want is not, it opposes diametrically what the church wants, what the church understands, then I'm sorry, but it's you guys who don't want to marry. It's not me. Now, one more thing, sorry, but it's important. The distinction between internal forum and external forum is very important. So if you know something through confession, you cannot do anything with that information other than encourage the person to come clean, right? But if is with giving communion, right? The internal forum and the external forum is a very important division. So if you learn something because they tell you in confession, you cannot even act in accordance with what you learn, right? And the typical question is, what if they confess that they put a bomb under the confessional? Do I gotta stay there and die, martyr of the sacrament? Hopefully that won't happen. But let's say 2 hours before the wedding, the groom says, "Hey, I would like to confess," and you say, "Okay, let's do this." And then he says, "Well, the thing is, I'm having an affair. I'm seeing this other girl." But what do you mean, man? You're about to get married. You're gonna lie. Yeah, I know. It's terrible, right? Yeah, but I mean, repent, man. Otherwise, I cannot give you the absolution. Yeah, but man, you gotta stop this wedding. But you cannot say, "I've learned something. Someone is not being honest," right? You cannot do that. As opposed to if you learn something in the external forum. Or in private forum that is not sacramental, like in a conversation with them, you're gonna say, "Hey guys, I'm sorry, in this situation I cannot marry you." Right? but be very careful. Be very careful. Only limit preventing someone from getting married is a very serious limitation of fundamental rights. So it should only happen in the most certain and grave cases. Right?
And in an external forum too. Yeah.
Exactly.
You said to call you. I could envision a situation where, you're having a conversation with somebody. They reveal what you said. Could you say, "Well, can I make a phone call anonymously, speak to you?" Obviously, you're not revealing anybody's names or anything like that.
Of course.
And tell the penitent, "Well, could you come back in 20 minutes?" And,
Of course. I mean, that's wise to do.
Yeah.
In some situations, in the confessional, right? Because you don't know everything, and what you cannot reveal is the person and the sin, right? And you gotta be extremely discreet about everything you learn through confession. If someone asks, he was for confession today, I don't know what you're talking about, and you move on. But of course, sometimes you need wisdom, so you ask about a case to someone, an expert in moral theology, or someone, hey, I have the following thing. What would you, how should I? And yeah, absolutely. And that's great to do, for all of us.
Is there anything in terms of conditions that the church would accept in terms of
Yes.
preconditions?
Yes, past and present conditions can be accepted with the permission of the bishop. So, I've never seen a case, but it could. Like, I want to condition the validity of my marriage to this thing. And the bishop says, okay, off you go. That would be okay. The thing with conditions is it can be anything. It can be anything, literally, depending on how crazy you are. It can be anything. So ultimately, anything could be a condition to a marriage. Of course, the bishop, to grant the dispensation, at least needs to be certain that the condition is met. Otherwise, he would be allowing an invalid marriage to be celebrated. Right? Yeah. Something else, fellas, brothers? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you. You guys are awesome. Thank